Okay. So George, you were a minister in Selma in the early years of the movement there. And before the Selma movement really kicked into high gear, you had to leave and you ended up in Oklahoma for a few years where you connected with some of the early, you did some migrant ministry, you connected with some early activity in the farm workers movement. And then by the time the Black Power era came around, you were in Chicago. And you had this opportunity in Chicago. And I should say something about the context of this time. You know, by the late 60s, the civil rights movement was transitioning away from being it was never solely focused on the Jim Crow South, but it's starting to become more expansive and focus on taking on systemic racial inequality all over the country. And Martin Luther King has a Chicago program tackling unequal housing, racialized poverty. And you have a chance to sit down with King in the basement of a union hall and you brainstorm with him for a full hour talking about what it would look like to build a white anti-racist community, what it would look like to build an effective white anti-racist political education program. And Martin Luther King is very supportive of your efforts, especially to mobilize white people. And I should also say that at this time, there was a broader trend in the Black freedom movement coming from SNCC, coming from Stokely Carmichael, coming from the Black Panther Party, all these different groups and figures also urging white people to mobilize other white people. So can you share with us your understanding of why the Black freedom struggle generally and why Martin Luther King maybe specifically thought it was so important for white people to have that focus? Why is that so important coming from their perspective?
Well, let me say first of all that I had arrived at the point that if I was going to be involved in anti-racism, that I needed to deal with the folks who were really the people who needed to be confronted and educated especially not simply about attitudinal racism, but institutionalized, embedded racism that existed not only in the South, but also in Chicago and throughout the country. And so when I was invited to come to Chicago to set up an anti-racism program under the auspices of three major Lutheran bodies, and that request was on their part was through Lutheran Human Relations Association of America, which was based in Valparaiso, Indiana. I was fully aware that probably what the church bodies anticipated in terms of anti-racism was setting up hunger centers for poor Black people, et cetera. You get the idea. But I felt differently, and I had not quite figured out how to address that situation. I had some ideas, I had a vision how it could be done in a somewhat effective way. And then I was given this opportunity to meet with Dr. King in the basement of this union hall, which gave, and that was shortly after I arrived in Chicago. And I wanted to bounce my idea, my vision, if you will, off of him. And he really was strongly affirmative. He thought that I was, as a white clergy person, as a white person, I guess, not simply clergy, that the focus on the white community, and he thought that I should focus specifically or primarily on young people. He felt that I was right on target. He didn't see too many doing that. He saw a lot of people, whites involved supportively within the civil rights movement, but usually associating with the agenda of Black people in a supportive way. And he felt that there needed to be some kind of focus on really beginning to deal with seriously with the white community. So you need to understand that. And in that conversation with him, he strongly affirmed what I was thinking and what my vision was, but he went beyond that because I had not anticipated. I met with him for about an hour and a half. I didn't anticipate spending that much time with it. But he gave me a lot of feedback on how he thought this should be done. And I appreciated that because it was important. and that was in essence what that meeting was about. Let me say one more thing in connection with that, and this is while I was in Chicago, because I think it's related. I was invited by a group of African American women and a group of white women who were involved in the women's liberation movement, and they were attempting to get Black women more significantly involved. And I don't know for what reason, but they asked me to help facilitate that meeting between those two groups. And I would tell you what came out in that meeting was the African American woman communicating very clearly with these white women that they didn't have the time and the energy, nor should they be devoting time and energy to the white women's liberation movement. They needed to be significantly and completely dedicated to the civil rights movement in the Black community and be in a supportive relationship as significantly as they could be. And they told these white women that they needed to be dealing with white women, and they needed to be dealing with them on the issue of racism. So that kind of confirmed that I was moving in the right direction, I guess. I felt that was for me as the facilitator of that meeting, and I didn't have to do much facilitation. It was an affirmation of the direction that I was going in, and what we were shaping to be done in the Mansion community.
George, could you share with us something about your process of building a white anti-racist community? I know that community as a theme has been central in your life. What has led to a strong sense of community, and especially a white anti-racist community?
Well, let me say I didn't think of myself as building an anti-racist white community. I saw myself as preparing people to be part of building white anti-racism. And so what we were doing, in effect, at the Mansion was educating people, getting them to understand more fully the sum and substance of racism in this country and how embedded it was, and preparing them in whatever vocation, whatever direction they were going to take in their life, to see it, their responsibility as also educating white people and building an anti-racist community. So in effect, we were kind of preparation grounds for that. And I never thought of myself as building an anti-racism white community, but preparing people to participate in very substantive and concrete ways in that movement. And you know, when I take a look at what some of the people, a lot of the people have done who came through the whole Mansion and what they've done, I'm not disappointed.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember you telling me, George, was that you see the legacy of the Mansion, the true legacy, as not even necessarily being what happened at the Mansion, but the way that the experience at the Mansion help to prepare people in the way that you're talking about now to live to go out there and live an anti-racist life and to do good work for the rest of their lives because of some of the foundations.
Yeah, let me say one more thing. What I felt was the way whites thought about racism, they thought about it as a Black problem. And the problem was that Blacks had to lift themselves up by the bootstraps. And that would solve the problem. Then they would become acceptable and they could move into more prominent positions in the community and active roles in the community. Well, I didn't think it was a Black problem. I thought it was a white problem. And that's what we had to deal with. At the roots of racism in this country, it was a white problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just felt like that would help to introduce some of your thinking and some of the key experiences.
Yes.
And now at this time, for the rest of our session together, we're going to be in a whole group conversation with George. And so what I want to do now is to invite everyone to take a moment to breathe together and to reflect on something that you want to lift up and be in discussion with George about. What is alive for you? what question might be on your heart, on your mind, that you might want to lift up and talk with George about. So let's all just take maybe just 1 minute. You can close your eyes. Let's take a few breaths together. See what that thing is that you'd like to lift up and share. And in 1 minute, we'll start that process of sharing that with George. This might be a growing edge that you have. This might be a reflection on where the movement stands today. What is it that you would like to lift up? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Something that George asked me when I floated this idea of this event by George. George said that he had talked so much about his own life, and what he really wanted for an event was to hear from us, and was to hear, what are we, those of us who were involved with building a movement today, what are we thinking about? That's what felt meaningful to him. And that felt really rich to me. So I look forward to hearing what's on your hearts and your minds. What I want to ask folks to do, just so we can keep track of things, is at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. And if you have something that you want to share, if you can click on that reactions button and then click on the hand raise emoji, and that will help us to, just facilitate the questions. So I see that we have our first question up. Yeah, Scott, thank you for sharing.
I put it in the chat because I was guessing maybe it would be easier. But so you can read it out loud if you want, or George can read it out loud, but it's in the chat.
Okay, I can go ahead and read that for you, Scott. Scott says, he's looking for some concrete advice and wisdom. What is your advice for us in 2022, 2024, to call into the racial justice movement white people who are currently indifferent or uninterested? How can we encourage them rather than alienate them? How much time in general should white people spend in white affinity groups discussing racism, etc., so as not to say the wrong thing in interracial groups versus spending time in interracial groups?
That question is directed at me?
Yes.
Wow.
You have a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience, and I hope you don't mind. I'm really looking to partake of your wisdom and insight.
Well, I appreciate that compliment. But what I would say simply is that's something that in your local area that you and others who you are associated with and are serious about dealing with embedded racism as it gets expressed in your own community, of you taking a look at that and collectively, because I think the answer is not simply in my wisdom and in my experience. I think it's in you and in the community and the group with which you're a part, because you have a collective wisdom. You know your community better than I do. And I think that that's a question that you really need to deal with seriously with others, and come into some kind of agreement in terms of your own perceptions and familiarity with your community, what the issues are and where people are at. And I think you can come up with the answer on how to more effectively deal with that than I can out of my distance and out of my own experience. So I hope that's not copping out on the answer, but I think it's a communal, it's a communal effort, not in me telling you what to do and how to do it and who to do it with, but for you all wrestling with that in your own community. And I think within your group, there is that collective wisdom, and you will come up with the most effective answer to that question.
May I ask a follow-up, or that was it?
Yeah, please go ahead, Scott.
I appreciate the democratic idea of its collective and go back to my community. But if I may just push slightly, even though it's your birthday,
Sure.
There are ways of alienating white people and there are ways of encouraging white people. I'm sure you've been there. And so I'll be very specific. There's a belief that many people, but not all people, have that every single white person is a racist. So if that's the view that some people have, and you're bumping into white people who've heard that and are very angry about that, how do you respond to that perspective? We're not in a vacuum. We're in a place where the far right is weaponizing this. You know what I'm saying? They're weaponizing it with anti-CRT laws, etc. It's so if you want to pass it back to the collective, I got it. It's your birthday, but I would love to hear some wisdom.
Well, I can only talk about the way I attempted to deal with that, and I did start by dealing with the folks that you're attempting to influence here. I started with folks who were already open to learning and really themselves moving to a better and a more complete understanding of what it was going to take to deal with white superiority, institutional white racism, and so on. So I was not, in my own experience, I wasn't dealing with the hard right or the hard overt racist folks who were angry and hateful and so on. But I was dealing with people who were open, but didn't quite understand the nature of the problem, the nature of the challenge, the nature of the struggle. And that's who I work most effectively with. And those are the people who became part of a stronger anti-racism understanding and went on in their own vocational journeys to become more involved in those kinds of activities. So, you know, I sat down with the head of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Alabama at a restaurant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he was personable. You know, we ate hamburgers together, and I dealt forthrightly with him, and he dealt forthrightly with me. And out of that meeting, I convinced that I really did not want to spend my energy and my time attempting to convert him or to move him out of his embedded leadership and his embedded beliefs as a head and a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And I wanted to, I found myself more drawn to people who were at least open and had some curiosity and had some feeling in their own lives that things weren't right. And that's probably who I worked with primarily and focused my attention on. So, and the dilemma in this society, I think, is the same thing. You know, we can be so focused on trying to convince some of the far right, overtly racist, may not even believe they're racist, but racist folks. But there is a whole nother ground of people who don't think they're racists and who aren't doing anything. And that's for me, even in the Cleveland area, that would be the focus for me. That group of people who are not active at all and yet have some openness to talking about it and addressing it.
Mm-hmm. I know there's a couple folks who have had their hands up for a while, but Sarah Riley, I know that you had a similar question. I was wondering if you might want to build off of what Scott lifted up.
No, that last thing you said was helpful. So thank you. We're going to start with our own people and slowly gather more and more that are willing to be educated.
Right. Let me say this, that one of the things I found helpful in what I did, even if I was dealing with the head of the Ku Klux Klan, was deal with that person respectfully. Respectfully.
Yes,
There's-
thank you.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask another question, but there's so many people that have other things to ask, so I'm going to skip my own stuff. Al Lind, you'll be next, and then Alan Gilberg, you'll be after Al Lind.
George, a short question and then maybe a little longer one. What dates were you in Chicago? And if you remember, what year was that when the black women and the white women got together?
That was, I came to Chicago in 1965 and I was there for 6 years. And located in the old Leopold Mansion in Hyde Park, not too far from the University of Chicago, where we lived, and that was that mansion was the base of our anti-racism program, anti-racism work with whites. So I was there from 66 to 65 to 71. That meeting was probably it was prior to the Democratic Convention in 68. I can't tell you exactly when, but it was prior to the convention, 68.
Okay, thank you. I was pinpointing it. I wouldn't be surprised if my mom might have been involved in that meeting or someplace on the peripheral of it. My other question is, what's your experience with stereotypical groups of people being most open to participating in a white anti-racist community? Do you find that it's men or women, church people, not church people, young people, old people, who are most open to the message you have?
Well, since I came, and I was part of a religious community or a religious denomination, I found most of my open people within not simply my own Christian denomination, but within the Christian community. And but then it really grew beyond that. And there were people who were already disillusioned with institutionalized religion, who gravitated toward what we were doing in the mansion. Some of them became part of that community. So initially my entree into finding people who were open, and they were of all ages, by the way, in the Lutheran Christian community, but it spread beyond that after a while. So that was my experience. And here in Cleveland, the openness was probably primarily, and I should have said this about Chicago, the openness was primarily among young people. And we were flooded with young people. And most of the people in the community who were part of the community at the mansion and active in the work for a month, for a year, for 2 years, were young people.
And I just remember when you were sitting with Martin Luther King, he urged you to focus on young people himself.
He told me to focus on young people too, right?
All right, I'm going to move on to Alan Gilberg.
So, George, I was in Selma as well. I don't remember running into you there, though.
When were you there?
In 65, in May.
Yeah, I wasn't there anymore.
Well, it was the march over the bridge that never made it.
And I was not there. I was already in Oklahoma in 65.
Ah, okay.
I was in Selma from 58 to 63.
Okay, so you were there for a stay, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I have been doing a lot of writing and thinking about how white supremacy, patriarchy, and racism are toxic for white men. And I wonder if that has anything to do with your experience, because, you know, if you look at white men, we are first in suicides, first in heart attacks, first in alcohol addiction, first in drug addiction, first in shootings, mass shootings, first in gun ownership, and on it goes. And every demographic in the country is living longer except white men. We're living shorter. And I think it's really important for us to get the message out that this is bad for us, even though we're on the top of the pyramid. I wonder how you.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more, but I would have to tell you that when I was in Selma, the key people for me in the white community were white men. Not that the women weren't open, but I guess it was because of just the nature of the society and patriarchy and so on. But in Selma, most of the people who were really supportive openly were white men, and that included in across the board, even in the Jewish community. It was the men, and probably had that was more of a commentary on the nature of the society and so on, patriarchy and male dominance and so on. But you know, I mean, you've hit on an issue, and communicating that is, I don't know whether you preach that or you give an opportunity in a setting for people for white men to be open about that in a place where they feel safe and which they believe their manhood is not going to be diminished, where they have an opportunity to be honest. And I've always found that that's the most important thing to get people to open up, is to be in a community where they feel they're going to be listened to without condemnation, and it gives them an opportunity to really share their journeys, share their struggles, share, be honest, to be open and honest, maybe for the first time in their lives, to be honest. So creating that space where people discover that, you know, where they don't have to prove anything, but they can be open and honest and feel open and honest and sharing with others. That's a critical thing in the process, I think.
Amen.
You know, I know we're here to be in conversation with you, George, on the occasion of your 91st birthday, but I'm also aware that there are a few folks from White Men for Collective Liberation here who I think have probably really thought quite a bit about this question. I want to maybe open up a chance for if someone from that group might want to share something about that specific topic. It seems like we have a special opportunity to do that.
I would like to hear from others. You know, I told you that. I really like to hear from others what they're experiencing, what they see as the critical issues, what they're doing that they feel is reasonably effective and creative in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. Because I'm at that point in my life. I told you I'm tired of telling my story. I'm trying to live in the present, even at 91, and I'm trying to contribute to the issues. And I'm working with a lot of young people. I'm privileged to be working with a lot of young people here in Cleveland who are on the front lines of the movement today, and I got to learn a lot to learn from them. So I was really interested in hearing where most of you are at, and what you see as the critical issues in your own community, locally, statewide, national level, and so on. I mean, we can all talk about the national level. You know, we can talk about the fact that 19 Republicans controlled states have made it extremely more difficult for people to vote. Yeah. And what are we doing about that collectively? You know.
Well, I'm gonna. I will. Based on the time that we have left, I'll try to invite some more voices into the room to do exactly that, George. And I want to start by once again maybe calling in some folks from White Men for Collective Liberation, because I realize there's some wisdom in the room about that particular issue of how do we mobilize white men and how do we help them realize that patriarchy and white supremacy really hurt them. Any thoughts?
from me.
All right, Greg.
Yeah, just also recognize that Janet has a hand raised. So, oh, is that from before?
That I was addressing the issue of how do we get white people to listen? I
Mhm.
think that was one of the questions.
Mm.
And excuse me, I've got laryngitis. One of the ways that we did it, I think, in the South was 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education said it was illegal to have segregation in the schools. 10 years later, George Wallace was still saying segregation forever, even though the laws had been changed. So I belonged to a group, it was a national group of women that went around and talked to white groups specifically. Probably the 90% of the groups we talked to were police academies, all the schools, churches, women's groups, just various groups. And we told our stories. And I found out at that time, here I was a white Christian, that there are two Americas. And I belonged in Alabama to one America that was wonderful. Everybody wanted to go back to that America. Well, we had 4 minority women that were in the other America. And what they did was tell their stories about what life was like in Alabama, living in that other America. White people had never heard some of these stories. And I think it's the stories that change people's hearts. It was changed legally, but hearts had not been changed. And people were really open to these women telling their stories. And I think that's real important as far as getting to get white people to listen. Stories, I think, are important. The group I belong to is called the Panel of American Women, by the way, and it was a national organization. And they're thinking about starting that group again because we need to do the same thing. And it's almost always talking to white people. And they were very open to us.
Thank you so much, Janet. And to remind folks, this is George Hrbek's sister. And you just, I hope that we can digest what you just shared, Janet, and maybe think of what are the stories that are powerful today? What are the stories that could help to inspire people and mobilize people today? Because I mean, obviously doing what I do, I think stories are powerful too. And I really appreciate you lifting that up. Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Janet, and thank you, Lynn. And in thinking about stories and listening and hearing others' stories, I think one challenge we've faced in both in my chapter in New York City of showing up for racial justice, and it seems to be a consistent pattern across chapters, is just how few men are involved, and white men not being drawn to this work in significant numbers. And I think having more stories, not just hearing stories across race, but I think to the questions you were raising, Lynn, and I want to reference also what Alan Gilbert was sharing. I think it's really helpful for white men to hear the stories of other white men. And then, so I really appreciate the work that Lynn's doing of and sharing your story, George, and the stories of others as examples, as models. And I think for white men to hear each other and to hear also each other's pain and the way in which white men are suffering from racial capitalism and maybe haven't thought of it in those terms, are suffering from the demands of patriarchy. So that's something that I'm very committed to in my organizing and still exploring best ways to go about that. But I do think that the story sharing as an organizing tool, as relationship building, and community building and creating a sense of belonging is really important. And I think especially if we look at white men who may be susceptible to sort of siren calls of the far right, you know, I think what those groups, as terrible as they are, do well is provide a sense of belonging and you know, saying we hear you, we hear your pain, we affirm your grievance. And so I think you know, a question, sort of guiding question for me is how can we acknowledge people's pain and affirm their feelings, but redirect the grievance.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Greg. I know there's a lot of things that must be alive for folks, all kinds of things we could talk about. I want to invite other people who haven't spoken yet to raise their hand. And Michael, thank you.
Yeah, let me unraise my hand. Okay, thank you. So George actually spurred me to mention this. I work for a nonprofit public interest law firm in Wisconsin. We represent people who have difficulty getting healthcare coverage and people who might have coverage but have difficulty getting their benefits to work for them. And one of the issues we've been addressing for practically 30 years now that Wisconsin is just intransigent on is something that I sort of want to hold up. Not necessarily thinking that George has the answer for this. Maybe Joe and I can talk about it later. And it might be present in other states as well. Wisconsin has a Medicaid policy that insists that if a woman is unmarried and pregnant and on Medicaid and gives birth, the father has to pay the state back for the costs of labor and delivery. And in that context, Wisconsin has probably the worst rate of minority infant mortality in the nation. And we believe that this public policy, apparently benign, many people say, oh, what the heck? You know, dad's got to be responsible. But it has a disparate impact on Black women, especially in Milwaukee County. And Milwaukee County has fought us tooth and nail to hang on to this policy, even though the federal government, as long ago as 1991, said no state should ever do this again because it is not good for babies. And now Wisconsin is one of only 7 states to still cling to this policy because it's a $25 million business for the state of Wisconsin. So it's an apparently benign public policy buried really deep in the weeds of Medicaid, and yet it has a huge impact on minority pregnant women, especially in Milwaukee County, many of whom are afraid to apply for Medicaid because they know that their boyfriend, their partner is going to get stuck with this bill. So I just, because of George's invitation to call out racially influential state issues, I just thought I would mention this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that, Michael. Thanks for working on all the issues you work on too.
I don't know if anybody else lives in a state that does this anymore.
I wouldn't know.
Maybe it's so deep, we don't know where it is.
Right, it's pretty weedy,
Does,
but
does-
it's, you know, it's a $25 million business.
yeah.
Well, it's one of those, as you've described, an embedded policy, but maybe not too many people know about even. And there are other policies like that. Or practices.
Mhm. Is there anyone else who has a question or something that's feeling alive for you that you might want to share with us tonight? All right, Dinah, thank you.
Yes, well, I'm resonating a lot with, I think it was the first question that was raised about, from someone from Surge about the whole issue of the importance of white people working in white affinity groups with each other, and also the importance of being in multiracial, multicultural groups. And the, you know, that the tension of, well, I don't think it's an either or really. I do think there's tremendous value I experience as a white woman in groups I'm in of all white people in doing our own work on connecting with our own racism and white supremacy, and working to be part of groups that are hopefully led by some minority folks, and knowing how to do that in a more humble and respectful way. And that's hard. I'm in not only Racial Justice Allies group in Santa Rosa, but also a group that is looking at our settler colonialism. And it's a group that is both white settler colonial, people, and people of color who are settlers, and has 2 indigenous women in it. And that's been incredibly rich, looking at all those issues together. But it's also very challenging. It often, it's, we've been trying to do more honest, vulnerable sharing, and it gets, gets tense as processing things can be. And there's a move toward some of us meeting separately as the white group, the people of color also meet separately. So there's just, this is a very rich area. At the same time, not wanting to get so caught up in that we don't find things to do that are active in the systemic issues in our community. So I just, I don't know that I mean, that's the cutting edge for me, I guess. And I guess I'll leave it there. There's more thoughts there, but there are other people with their hands up. So thank you.
Thanks for that input.
Yeah, thank you, Dinah. George, is there anything that you want to respond to in terms of what Dinah just said?
No, I understand what she said, and I think that, we have to work in our own groups. At the same time, we need to be allies with our other community members who are not the minority so much anymore as they are people of color, African-American community, and so on. But we really do have to do a lot of work among the white community, I think. And at the same time, we have to be able to work in concert with some of the movements and efforts like Black Lives Matter and so on as we do this.
Mhm. Yeah, and how do we strike that balance?
But
There's
too often we made it the burden. This is my perspective. We made it the burden of Blacks to change the minds of white people. You know, and what happens, the white response is one of sympathy, but still paternalism and so on, so often.
yeah.
And they shouldn't have to bear the responsibility. They've got their work cut out for them as it is. And they can't do our work for us.
Yeah, it gets me back to that opening question that I asked you. You know, why did Martin Luther King so strongly value your effort as a white person to mobilize other white people? And I think that what you just said there is at least part of the answer.
Yeah, I think I felt strongly about that. I still feel strongly about that.
In the interest of time, there's a few other people with their hands up. Just to do a quick time check, we have 15 minutes left in this conversation. And so I'm just going to move right along. And Lauren, looking forward to hearing what you want to lift up.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like everything that I'm hearing so far makes a lot of sense, and I can receive it and I can hold it and I see all of you. And it's just not my experience. I guess I'm calling in from the center of cancel culture, where you're not supposed to listen to white people and you're only supposed to listen to folks of color, and trying to connect and talk and lift up white voices or build any kind of affinity space or caucus space for white people is just an absolute sin. Because you are excluding people of color, you are centering white voices. And I'm finding my work, as so many people are talking about, you know, the impact this has on folks of color, that exact same impact is being felt by people who are like hyper vigilant in this work. And people who we see and experience as, well, actually, let me just stop. I feel like I'm working with white liberals. And I feel like it's just it's a whole other animal. It's a different beast. But it has the exact same outcome. And I'm finding that really fascinating and refreshing as I'm listening to this, that it's having the exact same impact. And it's something that I've thought about, or I've like kind of hunched on or hypothesized that, yeah, this is all just kind of bad news. And so, yeah, I guess I just really appreciate being in a space where my people, as we're talking about like getting our people, collecting our community, connecting those who are closest to us, that's academic community for me. That's queer and trans family for me. And that family has so much self-hate about being white, that it turns into appropriating and exploiting Black intellect and Black labor, to say, I don't want to have any thought of my own, because I don't want to hurt you more, but in not wanting to hurt you more, I'm actually going to hurt you more. And it just becomes this like really intense Sisyphus moment within white liberalisms. Yeah, I guess I want to like bring that up into the space that that's the cutting edge for me, or that's the edges that I feel in this work. And part of that just feels like I feel really lonely in this conversation, because I would love to have a conversation with a really angry, explicitly racist human being, because I know who I'm talking to. And in academia and in the queer and trans spaces that I've run in and do run in, I guess with Malcolm X, everyone's a fox or a snake in the grass. And trying to get them invested in a white affinity space or white healing or white love is an uphill battle. So I want to bring that into the space. There's no real question, but rather that's what I'm dealing with, George.
I appreciate that. And I understand that because a part of what we were doing in our anti-racism training was to help whites understand that they really had not yet discovered their full humanity and their worth as human beings, and that they were also captives of the racist system and the negative impact it was having on them. So the idea was not to have white hate themselves, but to really take an honest look at the system that was also negatively impacting their being as fully human as I think we're all called to be. So as Martin Luther King said, it's a liberation movement for everybody.
It is.
I feel like there's so much to talk about there, and also in the interest of time, I want to bring in a couple other folks in the remaining 10 minutes that we have. Is it Rachel or Rachel? Rochelle? And you are muted.
Rochelle.
Rochelle. Thank you, Rochelle.
So a couple of things. I want to just comment what you mentioned here. I had been in a number of workshops with a couple of Black men, and one was 70 and one was 80. And they shared that and the word was burden. They said, we still carry the burden. The 70-year-old said, I still carry the burden of getting in a car driving Black. And the stress, the tension, the fear. And then an 80-year-old Black man raised his hand and said, I'm 80 and I still feel that burden. And I use that word burden because I didn't hear that today. And I was just at a Juneteenth event. And I was sitting there as a white person, and all of a sudden I just started to cry. And it was like, we as white people carry a burden also. And I think George just hit on that. And I don't ever hear that word. And so not for today, but just to put that out there, you were just talking about white men. And there is a burden that I think I haven't heard that conversation, so just an idea about that. But talking about, I share a lot of stories, I live in work in a Black community. They share a lot of stories. And what I bring to the white community is the Black story. And they say, thank you, stay in your lane, talk to white people. And they tell me stories that I don't read in a book. And we have so many powerful books. And I'll give you an example. And why I'm saying this is because I didn't even know the questions to ask because I don't live their lived experiences. So one woman, maybe 25, she's sharing a story, Black woman, she got her license, the driver's license, which I imagine most of you was like, that's pretty an exciting time in our lives. It's like, you're independent and it's exciting. And she said, right after that excitement, the next moment was fear, that she could be stopped, her Black body could be stopped by a police officer, and she didn't know if she'd get out of that alive. As a white person, I never thought about that Black person, what would happen getting a driver's license, that would be their next thought. So for me, what I keep learning over and over again is to stay in conversations, because I wouldn't even know, and that widens my questions. It's like, what else don't I know? As a white person, my experience, I know that I don't get stopped, that I get, but I never thought about the fear that she would have right after getting her driver's license. So so for me, when I look at white spaces, I'm always looking to just challenge them, because I do have the privilege and honor and humbled to hear a lot of Black stories that I can share that white people have never heard about. So they can't feel that heart. Someone mentioned, you can have the policy, but you need the heart. I'll stop there. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
I appreciate you really sharing that, because when you talk about embedded white racism in policies and practices, they have to hear those stories, and they know how those policies and practices impact the lives of the people that they really are intended to impact in a negative way. So the stories are important to really even dealing with what we call institutionalized racism. It's important. Those stories, they need to hear them.
Oh, like I said, I believe it's all about the stories, and I've been so fortunate to be able to share so many that I didn't know. I mean, I lived in my white bubble, and I don't live in a bubble anymore, and it's important to share those stories. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you, Rochelle. And George Marks, you're next.
I have I think a very simple, basic question, and that is, when I'm dealing with white allies, men like in organizing like Men for Collective Liberation and other areas, I find all this finding ourselves and this fear of doing things. And the right isn't waiting around till they have everything perfectly done to attack us. And the question that's not just directed at George is, like, I'm just started volunteering at an abortion clinic. I'm also doing mutual aid work. And I get a tremendous amount of this connection with people, young people, queer people, trans people, and women in terms of supporting abortion rights. But the allies I see with whatever the issue is, they seem so prone on learning and learning and learning, but not learning from experience or learning from doing things. And I'm wondering if others experience that and how they help undo it. Thank you.
We always used to say that one of the things that we felt pretty clear about was that people do not think their way into a new kind of acting. They act their way into a new kind of thinking. So as much as you can provide an experiential thing for people, in which they can discover things for themselves and begin to raise the questions, I think that's the most important way to move ahead, which is what we tried to do at the mansion. That was our whole approach to helping people understand the actual nature of racism in this country, and the exercise of racism in this country is to give them an opportunity to experience that and begin to raise the questions themselves.
I also just want to return to that moment that we opened with you in the basement of the Union Hall with Martin Luther King. And he urged you to focus on white youth, but you guys also talked about experiential learning, and he was emphasizing in the way that he helped you think that through. That simply,
The exact words he used, he said to me, George, you've got to dramatize it. You have to dramatize it. Don't lecture. Don't make it some kind of academic, thing, but help people to begin to experience it, and help them to begin to confront the questions that they really have because of that encounter and that experience.
I am.
Honey, it's right out of time.
Go ahead.
It's right out of time.
Oh no, I was going to say that we just have a couple minutes left, but George, if you had another thought that you wanted to express, maybe we could have that be one of our final thoughts, and I have a closing for us. But
well,
there's something that you want to finish?
Lynn, before we get to that, since I raised it on chat, I think George should tell us who lives in the mansion now.
Yes.
Obama. He still owns he's not living there, but he still owns the house. And he and his family moved in before he became a candidate for president. And I wrote a letter to them and said I wanted them to know that they were moving into a house with great spirit and history. And I never heard anything back from them, but a biography of Michelle came out, and a neighbor came running up to me. I was working out in the backyard, and she said, George, you're in this biography of Michelle Obama. And I said, what? And sure enough, in this biography, not her autobiography, but a biography about her, was this one-page description of what had happened in the house that they moved into, what the history was. And she quoted the letter that I wrote to them. So yeah, that's who bought the house, bought the mansion eventually.
The book is Michelle Obama, A Life.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely amazing. And we are at time here.
Lynn, can I say something?
Yeah, please, George.
I've had 91 birthdays. I don't remember them all. I don't remember my first, second, or third. The first birthday I remember was when I was 4. But I've had a lot of birthdays, but I just want to say this is an amazing birthday celebration.
Oh,
And I really appreciate it. It was unique, and I really appreciate it. And I really appreciated much from hearing from so many of you. Really, really. It's important for me to live in the present and to hear how people, what their perceptions are now, what they're doing now, what they see as priorities, what are the struggles, what are the challenges. And it's important for me to hear that. I want to continue to grow. And that's why I appreciate especially hanging around much younger people. Because sometimes I think they're more in touch with now than I am.
I was wanting to know how in the world George at 91 is as sharp as he's ever been since I've known him. I don't know whether to thank my parents or to thank Stephanie. What in the world have you done to keep him looking good and sharp as can be, George? Happy birthday. I'm so glad you were born and that you're my brother and that you're just as sharp and wonderful as ever.
and I am honored and humbled, George, to have gotten to know you over the past year and a half, and for you to have given your time so generously to me, and to have been invited to celebrate your birthday with you. I'm so happy to hear that it was a beautiful experience. I hope that everyone here who attended tonight finds some inspiration or some joy, or maybe some questions have bubbled up that you want to continue to explore. I hope that you take something away from this. And I invite everyone to unmute themselves. And on the count of three, you will know what to do. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear George. Happy birthday to you.
I really appreciate that, but next time I'm going to see to it that you have a better choir leader. Anyway, thank you very much. This has been the icing on the cake of my day today, and I thank you all very much. And it was so good to see so many members of my family here. And even Charles C. had to sit quietly and listen to me for a change.
Trickle off. I want to say that the work that I've done with George is part of a much bigger project about writing the stories, lifting up the stories of white anti-racist elders and ancestors. I have just dropped the vision statement for that. It talks about how it can help us to mobilize white folks. So I hope that all of you open that up, give it a read. It's 4 or 5 minutes, a 4 or 5 minute read. Hope it inspires you. I hope that you feel inspired to share it with your white anti-racist communities or anti-racist communities in general. And once again, it's been an honor to host this. And George, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to share with us before?
Yes, I want to say to folks that in my ratings, I have rated Lynn 5 stars. And you have been one of the very wonderful, delightful, inspiring entries into my 91-year journey. So I really appreciated the relationship with you. And I hope we can sit down at the same table sometime together before I pass from this Mother Earth and drink a glass of wine.
Here's to that.
Yes.
I'll lift up my mug of tea. Here's to us. Here's to
So,
making it
yeah.
happen one day.
Thank you all, Vine. Good to see my daughter Kim and my favorite son-in-law, Mike. He's not my only son-in-law either.
You better step out to the Jim Rivera too.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
If you are direct friends and family with George and you want to stick around for a minute, please stick around.
And
with us.
hang on, hang in, keep at it. Moses never saw the promised land. We may not ever see the promised land, but we can say we were part of the struggle and the journey to make it become a reality.
Thank